So my presentation is on migrating your intranet and managing your documents in SharePoint. Those who don't know me, my name is Randy Perkins-Smart. I help out with the SharePoint user group. If you're on Twitter, my details are there, so feel free to tweet me, email me, call me, anything about this presentation or anything related to SharePoint, I don't mind. There's a hashtag there if you want to use it while you're tweeting. So word of warning, the views expressed in this presentation are my own. They don't represent those of my company, previous or present or future at all, so hopefully I won't be sued. Okay, so the agenda for today is a bit about my experience with migrations, then talking about different options you have with migrations, challenges around migration, looking at pre- and post-migration issues and things you need to consider, and then kind of wrapping up with a combination of lessons learned and recommendations throughout the presentation. If you have questions, feel free to ask them throughout the presentation. I'm happy to take them. If they seem like the response is going to be quite lengthy, I'll take it towards the end, although there is another presentation straight after this one, so we might have to take it outside. I've worked for quite a few companies during my career, some not-for-profit, big, large corporations, some pro bono work, contract work and various. So I've got quite a lot of experience in migrations and intranets and such technologies. I started off at Take Gallery. My main role there was to look after the intranet, both from a developer point of view and also an editor as well. So I kind of did everything, went out to the business, engaged with the business with what they wanted. One of the key requirements was to actually have content easily published to the intranet and be able to share that with the rest of the organisation. And that was classic ASP. It's not ASP.NET, it's classic ASP. So it was a bit cumbersome, took time to put sites together and share those. So what we did is I deployed SharePoint services 2001 back in the day, so about 12, 13 years ago, and used that. I've also had experience with migrating and using other content management systems. With the Take Guide there, it was specifically for desktop publishing. So it wasn't anything to do with intranets or webs. The focus was desktop publishing, and then it moved over to other platforms. I've also done work for the British Heart Foundation, again, using a classic ASP-based content management system and migrated that to SharePoint for internal use. Also did an extranet based on 2003 for nurses that the BHF supported, and use MIDIC CMS as well. I've worked for various legal organisations throughout my career. Again, a lot of migrations, taking it from bespoke systems or off-the-shelf systems over to SharePoint. More recently, I've been dealing with large organisations, 20,000 plus users, doing migrations, strangely from a software as a service platform over to on-prem, which you don't often find nowadays. It's very much let's all go to the cloud. But why are people moving to SharePoint? I know some of you were in As's presentation previously, and he has a similar quote up on his presentation. And it's simply because SharePoint can be quite a good tool. You can make it look good. It can benefit users. The Nielsen Group is an organisation which does lots of reviews every single year. This is a quote from a couple years ago, but they do this every year. So let's talk about migrating content. There's a number of things you have to do before you start thinking about migrating your intranet. Think about what content you have. Most organisations will obviously have normal Office files, but what about images, videos, audio, multimedia? You take organisations like Take Gallery, so back in the day when they were using Flash, Flash could be in art. How do you archive that? How do you take it forward for future generations to consume and refer to? Think about where your content is. So not just in what departments have content, but also what parts of the organisation geographically have content. If you think about merging your organisation's intranets, then how is that going to work? Can you merge your Luxembourg's users' data into your European farm, which is held in the UK? Think about who owns the content as well. Often what we find is that you go through an analysis of what content is in your environment and there's nobody to actually own it. Sometimes it might be obvious what department owns it, but nobody's taking responsibility. when was the last time policies are updated in an environment, who should own them. It's good to get stakeholders to actually buy in and get them to own pieces of content while you're thinking about the analysis stage of intranet migration. Thinking about what the infrastructure you have currently is and what you're going to plan to have in the future as well. Sometimes organisations think that what they have now is going to be suitable for what they have in the future. I found that with going from like SharePoint 2007 to 2010, the number of servers you needed didn't vary too much, but going from 2010 to 2013, you need enough double the amount of servers you should have, generally speaking. Think about software dates and licensing as well. Let's say it's 2014, January time, you've just renewed your license for your previous environment, say it's not SharePoint, and it's quite expensive, so your managers come to you and said, okay, well, let's move to SharePoint. You look at the cost, yes, it's cheaper, we should go for it. So you go to the board, possibly new financial year, April time, and say to them, look, we need this amount of money to migrate to SharePoint. They say yes. The project starts to kick off around middle of the year, July, August time, when people are on holiday. So really, it doesn't really start until September, October time. If you've got a 6-month project, that's going to take you past the date of when actually your current implementation environment licensing has to be renewed. So what do? Do you renew that license for another year, or do you decide, well, we're not going to renew it, not be supported, and take the risk? Think about resources, not just people resources, but network bandwidth, storage, backup, things like that. If you're doing a migration, some organisations will migrate their data to an intermediate location before they migrate to the new production system. If that's the case, you're going to potentially need twice, 3 times as much storage than you actually currently have now. Can your IT department deal with that requirement? When you're going through your analysis stage, think about the information architecture as well. When you're engaging your team and looking at what content you have, it's a good idea to understand where that's going to fit into the IA of the new environment, or multiple new environments potentially. If you're working in an organisation which possibly has many areas of the business, or they're very private with their data within the business, so for example, legal firms will obviously have so internal walls, if you like, in their organisation where one lawyer can't see what another lawyer is doing. Other legal firms will say everybody can see everything throughout the whole organisation. So you have to consider your information architecture, your security groups based around that. When you go through your analysis and your information architecture, that can actually help you decide what content you bring over and when you bring it over. So say, for example, you've got material that is already archived. Should you bring that over first because it's easy, not many people are looking at that content, or should you do it last because nobody's looking at that content? It may be an easier job to actually move that first because it will give you some sort of idea about the times it's going to take to move it from one environment to another environment, considering bandwidth of the network and speed as well. When you're going through your information architecture and UI, which we're going to touch on in a minute, you think about tree testing. Anybody here heard of tree testing? No? So basically this is the idea where when you're designing your UI, your navigation, it's a way of engaging your users to understand what's the best way to structure your navigation so they find the information as quickly as possible. So generally speaking, as few clicks as possible. Although users, most users nowadays don't mind clicking 7, 8 times. In previous years, they've said, oh, no more than 3 clicks. But that's kind of changed now. Users are more geared up towards clicking through different environments. As we said, with the UI, lots of people have been talking today about branding, and previous days in the conference about branding and how you can make fantastic websites. And we saw the quote from the NN group previously about, SharePoint can be seen it's made really pretty. I mean, Ferrari.com is a classic example. But some of the Microsoft speakers and other people who are in the know, if you like, have said, well, we're going to be limiting the amount of branding you can do in 2016 and even the current Office 365. If you look at things like Delve and Outlook web apps and the other web apps, there's a minimum amount of branding you can do there. So my viewpoint, when you are looking at migrating, think about doing as minimum amount of branding as possible. You've got to understand, is there actually value in branding your intranet? There was a quote by Microsoft about somebody at Microsoft saying, you don't brand Word, you don't brand Outlook, so why would you do an intranet? I kind of disagree with that. It needs some branding, possibly using colours to distinguish between one environment and another. I was working for a large firm, and the only way they distinguished between their different intranets was by colour. Literally, there was no branding at all. So the only way to look at the different environments was the colour of the intranet, because they used the themes. Think about web standards as well. Lots of organisations, especially governments, are queued up to actually providing an accessible platform for users. So think about HTML5, web accessibility, and the other standards coming out around taxonomy as well. As you think about the other devices and different users, the way we have to brand and design SharePoint has changed over the years. We used to be in a case where it was just desktop, and we've kind of moved on from that. Your CIOs and managers want iPads. You may have iPads yourselves or other tablet devices. You might have a Surface, and okay, Surface is more like a PC than other devices, and some devices like iPads have high resolution, so you may not have to actually change the way that the site is presented. However, other devices are coming out now. So most of us have mobile phones. Most of them are going to be smart mobile phones. So the UI will have to change for those devices. But other things are coming out, like smartwatches. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he's got a Microsoft band, and what he can do is he can get alerts on his band about text messages and emails and respond to those. So if you get an alert via email, via something like Nintex for a workflow, you can respond in a couple of letters on that workflow. All that is something from SharePoint creating an email, sending it to you, and you're responding. So although you're interacting with email, it is part of the SharePoint environment. So you have to think about what devices and how they're going to interact with SharePoint. During the migration, think about your content. Lots of people say, okay, search engine optimization is more about websites, but it applies to intranets as well. Think about the page titles, the metadata you're going to have in the environment as well. Different organisations use words in different ways. If you said football to an audience like this, most of you will think of Premiership and things like that. You go to an American audience, they're thinking American football. So the language you use in your organisation can differ. And if you've got an intranet which are merging from multiple regions, you've got to think about the language you use on your intranet as well, which will fall into taxonomies and keywords and things like that. You may want to reduce the amount of content if possible before you actually do your migration. That can and can't be a good thing. If you reduce the amount of content you've got to migrate, yes, it should speed up the migration, but how much time are you going to make your users spend on reducing the amount of content they require to actually migrate? Think about what you're going to migrate first. We spoke previously about prioritising archive data or waiting for it. So you have to think about what you're going to actually do. Lots of organisations now, because they have got tablets and devices like that, although you've got Word apps and Office apps as part of that. Some organisations are now thinking about converting a lot of their documents into PDFs and ebooks so people can read it on other devices as well. What language? If you're an international organisation, or even if you're just a local council perhaps, or just a business who has audiences outside of the UK, doesn't even have to be outside the UK because you've got Welsh language, for example, does your intranet have to be multilingual? I've worked for an organisation once where they defined that, English is the language for the internet. That's all we're going to use. However, they then bought a Canadian company and they used French, and it was mandated by law that information had to actually be presented in French. So they went from single language English intranet to a multilingual language intranet quite quickly. When you're doing your migration, there's disadvantages and advantages of doing it in different ways. So we're going to be looking at manual, scripted, and using tools. So the manual approach is usually worse because it takes so much time, unfortunately. I don't see any organisation nowadays doing this. In 2002, yes, I took the manual approach with SharePoint because there were no tools to do it other than using Explorer View and dragging documents from folder shares over to SharePoint. If you look at a scripted approach, yes, it's quite good to do a scripted approach, or if you like to do your own development and produce a tool to do your migration, that can work. generally to be quite costly. You've got to have a developer or an extreme power user developing those scripts or that code, so that's going to take time and money. They may or may not have experience in doing something similar before. So the gotchas like language, character sets, length of document names, renaming documents if they're a certain length, looking at different formats, how to handle XMLs, different character sets of the file extensions as well need to be considered. Has its advantages. It's tailored for exactly what you want to do, migrate your content. If you're migrating, say, from a bespoke database or even an old database, it may be that scripting is the way to go. Hopefully not. Hopefully it's something more up to date. Tools generally have the most advantage. So there are some tools that are quite, sorry about that. Well, that's come up. There are tools that will help you do the migration. So generally they save time. It's less resource required for those tools. What it will do, it will allow you to basically install the tool up and running quite quickly, things like ShareGate and other vendors out there who have something similar. So what I tend to find is that organisations do a combination of this. So you will find that most organisations will do 70–80% of the work with a tool. The rest of the 20–30% will be scripted or do manual approach as well, because in some cases, manual way is the only way to do it. So these are a few tools out here. Some of these tend to be mainly focused on migrating from a SharePoint platform, so 2001, 2003, older SharePoint platforms, to the latest and greatest, or online. Others are mainly focused on actually migrating bespoke CMSs or off-the-shelf CMSs that aren't SharePoint to SharePoint, and there's some which look at legacy systems, ones which are out of support completely and not used at all by, or not supported by the vendors, because either they've gone out of business or they just don't support that platform anymore. So we're going to look at a scenario. Some of you, who here does projects? So most of you will work on projects, I hope so. So this scenario is kind of built up from a number of organisations I've worked for over the years. So take this scenario where you've got folders for your projects. We see here that the organisation's decided to use a 4-digit number at the start, a dash, and the company name. So who here can see an issue with one of these right now? Yeah, 3 digits, spaces, anything else? No? There's a couple. So also you've got things like consistency. So if I did a piece of work for the BHF, British Heart Foundation, so it's not quite descriptive enough to understand what that client is. There's various issues with that. But let's say that's, they're fairly well organised. It's not the worst thing I've seen by far. But let's say they work really well organised. Let's say they've got folders, subfolders as a template. So this is an organisation which might use Prince2, and these are the processes and stages in Prince2. So they've created subfolders like this. People, say in project management teams would actually know what SU stands for and things like that. So that's quite a good structure. The disadvantage is that although you could possibly take a copy of that structure and reuse it, it doesn't mean that it's good practice. So for example, if somebody did a search on that folder for starting up a project, they're just going to find every single folder with that name. There's no decent structure there, really. So just break into a demo. Any questions while I bring this up? No? I believe, I think Kapow do that. I think they do Domino. Kapow, they've been bought by Knowledge Lake, I believe, recently. Yeah. Contact me afterwards. Grab a business card. So somebody asked a question, so you can win that. Somebody else asked a question. Who else asked a question and answered? Nobody wants one. Seriously, okay. I might just throw it at the people I know in the audience instead. So it does look like this internet connection is working, which is a bit of a shame. Flop, something like that, yeah. I don't know if I'm going to be able to connect. Nope. Let's guessed. Okay. So there's different ways to implement a folder structure like that in SharePoint. So one way would be to actually replicate it by having a document library with the name of the project, thing like they were doing before. Not a great way, and they've created these folders to represent the same structure. You know, it's better than it was, but not brilliant. One thing this organisation may want to do is they might want to add metadata. So if they want to add metadata regarding what stage they're at in this project, then what they might want to do is create a linked list or a list such as this, where you've got title and the code. They will then mostly want to add it to, say, this library. So within this library, it could. Does everybody know how to create columns in SharePoint? Yeah, so this is quite basic, so you must know it. So you could create a column, add it as metadata and things like that. But that's not really a great way of doing it. Really what you want to do is apply metadata to it instead. So I'll just go to projects. Load. So instead, what's happened here, if we just scroll over, the organisation's decided, okay, well, we want to apply metadata to everything. So instead, we're going to actually do add columns such as process, project code, and document IDs here, just for reference, and clients as well. And this can be applied metadata. So if I just see how this is set up. So if they were to add a document, I should have to save this back. I'll tell you what would be easier and quicker. So just taking a document, and we can see here that they've hooked up the document library to a term store, and they can now just simply, for example, type the client's name, and it should pull back client details if the connection actually works. I don't know what that. So it pulls back from the term store list of clients they've got. They can add this automatically, well, not automatically, but they can add this. And most of the users don't actually want to do something like this. And you mostly can set up rules where, well, if you know exactly what the project code is, you will know what the client is. And tools like concept searching can help you with that. They can automatically apply metadata. Or you could use a workflow to do that, or some custom code instead. Okay. We've covered that. So just going back to about the term store. So, for example, they've used starting up a project, but as we saw before, they had codes instead of doing the full description of that part of the process. So we see down there we've got synonyms and abbreviations for terms as well. So you don't have to worry about doing the typing in or even selecting the whole one. When you do a search, you can just type in SU and it will find it. We saw metadata. So does anybody here use document sets? So just one or two people. Does everybody know what a document set is? So most of you are saying yes. So obviously it's a group of columns associated with a term. So here we've got an example of the out-of-the-box document set has title, name, description. I'll show you in a second one I've created, but we saw the metadata fields that it had already, clients, process, and project code. So if I just go into that. there's various advantages with content types, and especially project sets as well. So you can hook up your project sets, obviously, to have metadata associated with them, but then obviously they can have content types associated as well. So we see here, here's the metadata. There's document set settings, which allows you to do other things like add predefined content types to that document set. So basically what that allows you to do, if we go back to the projects folder, we'll be able to create a document set. Let's do this. So you've got all our content types here. If you scroll down, we find the document set content type. Create a new one. We can give it a name, so we can do SP Evo 15. Let's say it is BCS. And we don't care about the process type. And technically speaking, process type in this scenario isn't required. It's just there because I left it there. Do a project code. I don't know what my numbers are. Doesn't really matter what project code in this scenario, and we'll do save. So what this goes away is not only is it useful because it can then inherit all your metadata from the documents you put in there, but what it will also do is take the name of the document set and apply it to all the content types and documents associated there, which we'll see in a second. Any questions while I wait for that? Okay. That's taken a while, so there is one I made earlier, so just 1 second, and I'll go over to that. Sure, there is one. So, okay, so, oh, there it is. I think it's just about finished generated. So what this has gone off and done, it's all out-of-the-box functionality. There's no custom code here at all. It's all via the UI. You created a project set. You've applied the metadata. Because this document set has got documents associated with the content types, it's taken the title of the document set and added it or prefixed it to all the documents it has automatically added in. So we've automatically got these documents created for us. Now, yes, these could be templated, and you could use Windows Explorer to copy templates from one place to another, but you wouldn't have these with their not quite unique names, but the new names as well. You would have to go in and rename those. So if you were using Windows instead, just folder shares, you would have to go in and rename each individual document, where in this case, the documents have been given a name, they've had metadata applied to them. If we just scroll over to the side, we can see that the metadata has been applied there. See if we can open that. I think that's open. So this is the business case document that we've just created. We can go in and edit it. We can then take, for example, the metadata that's been applied automatically to it and add it in. If I can't see. Unfortunately, I think it's. No, that's taking my thing away. I don't know where it's shrunk down the item I was looking for. No. So I can't find what I was looking for, but basically what you can do is you can enter the metadata in this document, and it will then also automatically update as it goes along. Let's do.
So if you drag a new document into there, does that document set apply that metadata to that new document?
So you have to set the document set to actually do that, to inherit the metadata, but yeah, it would. So depending also on the content type as well. If you've added a document which isn't a content type and doesn't have those fields, I think, I'm not sure if it does, yeah, it would automatically add it in because those columns are part of that document set now. Obviously, if it's an Office document, the metadata would be in the Office documents as well. If it's a PDF, I think in some cases the metadata is applied as well. If it's an image file, then I don't think you get that additional metadata. There is ways around that, though, to add the metadata into image files and other files as well. I think it's an Adobe standard which will do that for you. So we've seen document sets. So a lot of the organisations I've worked for have been very conscious about where their data is held. They're very much worried about meeting certain compliance rules and regulations and laws, and they have to do various things. So they're worried about consistency. So as we saw there with document sets, you can have some sort of consistency around your documents. You don't have to do it manually, which obviously saves time. Retention as well. They obviously sometimes they want metadata applied so they know how long to retain a document for. Some organisations I've worked for, they just keep all documentation, everything. They're not worried about deleting documents. Other organisations will say, oh, it's only 2 years and that's it. And in actual cases where they've actually got or working on a specific type of project, they will say, well, the project starts as soon as it's closed, we'll keep it for 2 years and then it gets deleted. They're not worried, even though it's related to law, keeping it for any longer. A lot of organisations I work with will produce document IDs. One thing to be careful of is document IDs are unique to a site collection. You can have 2 site collections with the same document ID. It's possible to do that in SharePoint. Obviously, it's not something you should be doing, so possibly need like a PowerShell script to go through your environment just to make sure that all the document IDs for each site collection are unique, because the prefix can be the same. I've seen some organisations to move towards QR codes. I'm not too keen on that, simply because it's not human readable. So if you've got a printed document, which I've worked with or started to work with a client with before, and you print a QR code and that physical paper, because it has to be physical paper, gets sent off somewhere and then that top layer gets destroyed or gets damaged, you can no longer read that. Now obviously numbers can get destroyed and damaged as well, but if you've only got a QR code, it can be more problematic. So combining it with barcodes or other numbers is useful as well. So moving on to the lessons learned. This is kind of a mix-up between things I learned and recommendations. So think about things I work with is clients often don't realise what they have to migrate or how much they have to migrate. So I was working with a client recently, and they had a cloud-based solution. And that cloud-based solution said, you know, you can use as much data as you want. You know, we don't care. It's a per-user cost. There's nothing around storage that we worry about. So, you know, if a user wants to save a terabyte to their environment or their user space, they can. We don't care. So coming to trying to migrate out of that environment, there's no way for them to actually understand how much data they have. They literally have to pull the data out of the environment and then add up how much space they've got. So in those scenarios, they're not that common, but in those scenarios, it's going to be very difficult to plan your migration. You could take 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, 100 random areas of that system, that environment, which has separate sites, and say, okay, on average, this is how much data we've had in these environments, and then, you know, calculate roughly what you might have overall. But it's not a strict science, unfortunately. Often, they don't think about their information architecture going forward, how many site collections they're going to have, what the impact of the environment is going to be. So who here uses site collections quite a lot? Anybody here just have one site collection? 100 or so? A few? 200? 300? Any more than 500? Any more than 1,000? 1,000. So one of the, yes, no? Any more than 5,000? 10,000? Do I hear 20? No, okay. So I've worked with an organisation and they had 120,000 site collections in one farm. So it's not ideal. There's issues with that, can be done. Wouldn't recommend it. It was quite a unique scenario, and as far as I know, that is still growing to this day. So they've got a bit of a challenge on their hands. Not having professional SharePoint staff. I worked with an organisation before where they had a great team of SQL people, great team of architects who knew, Exchange and data storage and SQL Server and things like that. But they didn't really know SharePoint. All they've done is gone to a few SharePoint presentations, had Microsoft speak to them. They've sat down with Microsoft, and Microsoft has, answered any questions they want answered, but they don't really know SharePoint. They don't appreciate SharePoint. And in that scenario, they had loads of issues which they could have kind of negated if they had actually spoken to SharePoint people who had experience for a number of years. Also need buy-in. So who here thinks they need buy-in from the top level for a project? So I actually disagree. It depends what type of organisation you are. So I work for an organisation where, although everybody says IT shouldn't lead the project, it depends who you engage. So I worked with an organisation who the project came from IT. It was actually me who was leading a project from IT, but we also engaged with internal comms. Engaging with the internal comms, the two departments worked together and got the project going, done all the user training, got feedback from users, ran all the groups. Governance wasn't a buzzword back then. But, we did the board meetings and things like that. We didn't have buying. I'm not saying they didn't buy into the thing, but we didn't ask for their permission. We just went ahead and done it. Because buying for the whole business is unrealistic. I've never seen it. So I kind of just, usually in a position where I just go off and do it, if possible. May contradict what other speakers say, but hey, that's my experience. User engagement. It's important to engage your users, the people who are going to use the platform. If you can show them that something that's going to benefit them, save them time and money, then kind of, although you don't need high-level back-in all the time, something like that, engaging your users who are lower down, doing the work day in, day out, filters up via various channels. You tell somebody in HR tells their manager is having dinner with somebody more senior, that more senior person is having dinner with somebody else, things like that. It all feeds up the chain eventually. Good and bad, so you've got to be careful from that point of view. Writing for the web isn't really required nowadays. Most people just write as normal, like they were for magazines, but back in the day, people were saying you need to write for the web. Generally, to some extent, that's gone a step further. People, will read Twitter, and 140 characters is about the amount they want to read, and they don't want to read any more. So you've got to engage your users with short pieces of text, and then possibly further content if you think it's required. Don't forget to train the people who are actually going to be using the system. There's evangelists in the environment, which I'm sure you'll be able to engage with, who actually will say they like the technology, because people do like SharePoint in some cases. I guess some of you will like SharePoint here, possibly not all of you. But also engage your technical staff. So often, although it's led from IT, say like architects and people like that, forget the help desk staff. And that's really important to engage your help desk staff, simply because when you're doing a migration, it's going to be them who are going to be getting the phone calls from the users saying, well, we can't do this, we can't do that. Combined Knowledge have a tool which can sit on your intranet and provide help, and that's good. But sometimes people just want to speak to somebody else. They want to be handheld, if you like, through a process. A lot of people say don't lift and shift your content. I think that depends on what you're actually doing. Who here actually speaks to the organisation when they're trying to make a change to the environment? Yeah, so a few people. So does everybody else just go off and do it? No, so I guess everybody actually tries to engage the user. I was working for an organisation once. The industry they were in, there were, say, 6,000 or so experts, and there was only one of those experts was allowed to be engaged with. And that one expert was allowed to be engaged with because they were married to somebody in IT. So we literally had to find out what the requirements were via a single person in IT to ask her husband, what do the users actually want? And all they wanted was an easy system. Yeah, right, SharePoint's not always easy, and something that worked, which sounds quite basic. But there was an uphill struggle because at the end of the day, users say, well, actually, we don't want to check in, check out. We just want to save our documents. But in the industry they were and the things they were doing with documents, it was key that they actually used check-in, check-out. There were a lot of issues around Office and old versions of Windows and things like that when they weren't using check-in, check-out. So that's another thing you've got to consider when you're migrating. Who here uses a different version of Office than they do SharePoint? So say Office 2010 with SharePoint 2013. Yeah, so I've come across that, and an organisation I was working with did Office 2007 with SharePoint 2010, and there were problems because Microsoft had this something like best, better, best scenario where basically the latest version of Office works great with the latest version of SharePoint. So I would always recommend keeping that level, using those two side by side if possible. I'm not saying you will have problems if you don't, but there's a possibility. Okay, so URLs. So a lot of organisations will change the name of their new SharePoint intranet to something else from the old one. Others will keep the same URL or the same domain name if you like. That's good if you keep the same, or even if you change it, that's your preference. But think about redirecting URLs. The chances are, if you're doing a migration rather than just an upgrade from one version of SharePoint to another version, the URLs will change. In which case, think about doing redirects in your environment. You can get ISAPI filters, which will basically plug into IIS. Everybody know what IIS is here? Yeah, so SharePoint sits on top of IIS and SQL Server. And these filters can basically say, take an old URL and redirect somebody to what the new URL is. Think about the time it's going to take to implement the migration as well. We spoke earlier about how the fact that software licensing, have you got time before it expires and things like that. People often underestimate the time it's going to take to do the migration. When you're kicking off a project, until you've actually understand how much content you've got, who the users are, and anything like that, I wouldn't put a time on when the actual switchover is going to happen. Been working with, worked with a client in the past, and they had a fixed deadline. So they've signed up to, work with a piece of software which was online until the end of June. That was a hard and fast fixed date. End of June, they're not going to extend the contract. All the data has to be out of the environment, which is online with the vendor. Otherwise, they will lose it, literally. There's no going back. Even if they, a day after the agreement cancels, the vendor's not going to keep the data. It's going to go. So you need to consider licensing, as we said before, and the time it's going to take to do the migration. Time to train users as well. Some organisations will do 5-day course, 2-day course, 1-hour course. I'm very much do a little and often during the upcoming release date of the new intranet or the new platform or the upgrade. I tend to find that users remember more if they do short bursts of information, and that's where online help is quite useful. Think about the metadata. We haven't touched a lot on taxonomies. Again, I've worked with an organisation who had the worst taxonomy ever, I think. They literally had shelf 1, shelf 2, shelf 3, because they come from a paper-based system to an electronic system. They kept that taxonomy. But they're the users, they bring in the money, lots of money. So you can't easily tell them it's complete rubbish, you need to start again. Because they haven't got the time, supposedly, to actually engage with you. So you may have to possibly run 2 different taxonomies side by side and map shelf 1 to a document library and apply metadata and things like that. Again, this is where things like concept searching, which can automatically apply metadata, help quite a lot. We spoke about poor classification. Special characters. Doesn't often impact English-speaking intranets and document management systems, but quite often when you're doing an international farm where you've got special characters, this can quite impact the URLs you have, your migration. It can cause lots of problems in the environment.
Have you found any good tools for bulk editing of metadata, for example? So if you find that a lot of people have the authors wrong on documents or don't use titles, is there any way to, I'd imagine on a Mac, you could write something with the automator to just drop files on a droplet and just rename them all. Is there any good tools for bulk that? Because you can do some of it within Windows itself, so you can right-click about 20 files and change
And do rename, yeah.
But it's interesting because if you type the name of the person, it's not the name in Active Directory, it's just a text. Whereas if you do it in Office documents, it has some sort of Microsoft ID. So we found
Yeah.
good tools for bulk editing.
PowerShell.
PowerShell.
Yeah.
So you need to get the data in and then bulk edit. I'm just thinking from if users have got a project from 10 years ago, they want to dump in
Right.
to a new archive system.
So although I said you might want to lift and shift, without considering what the content is. If it's from 10 years ago, you've already said, well, it's worth keeping because, in which case you should understand, if you've done your information architecture, looked at your taxonomies, you should be able to apply metadata to those documents.
I'm just thinking of the time, because we've got like 20 years of research data we've got to put into an archive.
So,
That will be unzipped and with huge amounts of data.
yeah, so there. As you consider, do you want to put zip files in SharePoint? So relevant information. So in those zips and those tars, there are Office documents. Okay. So if you've got Office documents or anything, well, it's going to have metadata. Okay, and chances are you saying it's going to a specific folder?
Quick view in a view once you've uploaded the data into it, then you can use the Excel type drag and drop.
Yeah, I mean, so if you've got an issue with the naming convention of files, then you need to understand what files you've got, and then possibly you can do PowerShell. If you're worried about just the metadata associated with each one of those documents, concept searching will go into a lot of file formats and work out what they're mostly about. So if you've got medical research on diabetes, for example, and a lot of the time it says blood glucose, blood glucose, blood glucose, it's a popular, not just words, but phrases as well, and it can apply that metadata automatically. Yeah, okay, cool. Analytics, I can't believe how many organizations don't understand what their environment are doing. The previous speaker I was at was saying that they designed a great intranet and didn't actually give what users want. Was basically a link or a quick way of getting to the menu of the canteen for the day. I mean, if they looked at analytics, they would see what's popular and would be able to do that. So, why wasn't that done? It makes no sense, because even out of the box, IS will give you some basic information, even if you've got it set to actually apply or capture all the data related to users' browser and times and things like that. It will give you quite basic information, especially files they've gone to. If you're doing more for SharePoint to SharePoint migration, but it applies to any migration really, like orphaned users, so users who have left the organisation, what do you do about that? So I'm very much of the ilk that if a user leaves the organisation, so joe.blogs, at company, whatever, that person's ID should remain. Some organisations say, oh, no, we'll delete it, so if we get another Joe Blogs, they can use that same. I disagree with that from a data governance point of view. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are. Anybody disagree?
No, we keep them.
Keep them, yeah. Now, Microsoft used to have issues with the amount of users you have in AD and things like that, but you can still get around that with the fact that you could actually still remove them, but make a record of who's been there and not reuse that ID. Yeah, but there's issues with the number of users you have and you have in AD, even if they're not active. It's an edge case, if you like, but it can happen. Remove unused sites is also a good thing to do. It will save time on your upgrade. So if you can imagine trying to upgrade 100,000 site collections, every time you go to a web or a site collection, it takes time to migrate. So even if there's one file in a site collection, the client was previously working at, they would say, yeah, we've got to migrate that. You haven't got an option. You need to do it. You can think about consolidating your webs into multiple webs into one site collection, or smaller site collections with one or two documents into webs. I'm very much let's keep things at site collection level. Some people disagree, but that's how I like to do things around because of issues with security. Manage your audit data as well. I was working with an organisation who did lots of searching on documents, and it got to the point is they had a root site collection, and all the root site collection had in it was a search page, and it was in its own content database. So if you're just doing a search, obviously there's no documents. So you're not accessing documents, which means you're not creating audit data. But this site collection was 600 gig in size, just because all the users would do was hitting the page, doing a search. So you've got to manage your audit data as well. Now, you can trim that, but if you're an organization who actually wants to keep your audit data, then you've got to think about archiving that off in some way. Metalogics have a tool to do that. You can use PowerShell scripts, export the data using PowerShell, import it into possibly SQL or something like that, but it's something that's worth considering. Okay, so I would, where possible, configure SharePoint rather than doing custom code or buying add-ons. I know I've recommended a few add-ons today, and I don't disagree with actually getting them if there's a reason for doing so. But I've seen organisations do custom code. It either hasn't been very good, or it's just a laborious thing to maintain as time goes on. Think about automating your migration, as I've said before. Does save a lot of time if you can do that. I said about analytics, it's always good having that. You know, web trends are out there. There's other tools for analytics and SharePoint. As I said, out of the box, IS produces logs, so you could use those as well. Implement governance, if you like to call it governance. It's existed for ages. Usually it was a strategy board or the intranet board or group or something. It's always been around. People have just gone on this buzzword and then said, okay, we need governance for intranets, extranets, and so forth. You know, it's just best practice, generally speaking. We've mentioned about training, doing short videos, doing lunch and learns, free out to see coffee areas and things like that. Just short tips for individuals who are going through a migration process, showing them what's going to be happening, when it's going to be happening, possibly who to contact if they've got questions and issues about when their data is going to be migrated as well. In an international organisation, you know, most of you think like, you know, workday is Monday to Friday, but in some countries they don't work on Fridays, they work on Sundays instead. So doing your migrations just on the weekend doesn't always suit organisations. You have to think about those people as well. Things like doing updates via email, if you've got an internal comm system, that's very useful. Floor walking is still very good as well. Social, possibly setting up a Yammer group or some sort of social network so people can talk about the migration would be good as well. I've seen in the past where people are able to put comments about what the migrations or what's happening about the migration and get responses. Everybody can see them, so everybody's on the same page, if you like. If you're actually going to implement Yammer as part of your migration or take it on board, I should also think about how you're going to monitor that. One of the delegates said they archive all the SharePoint information using some sort of email system. I've got possibly a query about that because things like likes don't actually get added as individual posts in Yammer as far as I know, so I don't think that's a foolproof solution. And obviously it's in Los Angeles, I think, still, rather than UK or certain other parts of the country, so you need to consider that. Haven't got much time. If you want to know more about governance, Ant Clay spoke, this is his book, you can get it via that URL there. I'm not going to talk more about governance, time's towards the end now. Project management is always key. If you want to use Prince2, fine, use Prince2. Agile, I find, is a better approach, but mixing the two is even better. Keep it simple. Don't try and do big bang. You know, it's better to do a good project in 2 years than a bad project in 6 months. It's going to be a lot cheaper in the long run. When you're looking at your requirements, have people come across the Moscow rating? Yeah, so this is a way of basically saying we want to have specific requirements, and this is the priority of it. It's very useful because users, it's easier to say to user, you know, really how much of an effort you want to put into this feature or functionality. Plan for the next version when you're doing your migration. It sounds a bit stupid, but even if you're migrating right now, it's a good idea to see what Microsoft planned for 2016 to understand what you should do. So from when we were going from 2010 to 2013, Microsoft put out a lot of information about things to consider. They're doing that again now, and people didn't really learn from what they've done in the past, so it's worth considering what Microsoft's saying about branding, about things they're doing around document management and security in Office 365, and things like that. Okay, that's it from me. Okay, thank you guys. That's it.